It's a pleasure for me to be with you today. I'm going to give you a brief analysis, a brief One Health analysis of food safety and security, antimicrobial resistance, and climate change in the 21st century. And yes, they are all connected. Let's see, for some reason, oh, there we go, okay. So climate change threatens agriculture and food security, which agriculture is the foundation of civilization. And antimicrobial resistance threatens antibiotic use and food safety, which is the foundation of modern medicine. So before I delve into my talk, I just want to go through a few definitions. One, food security means no hunger. Food safety means no foodborne illness. And antimicrobial resistance means bacteria that are, I'm going to use bacteria in this talk. It can also include viruses and fungi. But antimicrobial resistance, for the purpose of this talk, means bacteria resistant to antibiotics. So if you have a non-resistant bacteria and you give them antibiotics, they die. But if the bacteria are resistant, then they will continue to proliferate. So the One Health concept then that human, animal, plant, environmental, and ecosystem health are linked provides a very useful framework for examining these complex issues. And we need to discover the root causes of many of these challenges if we are to develop effective policies to address them. And it's important to remember that we interact with our environment every day by inhaling air, drinking water, and eating the plants and animals that we call food. And this is the One Health Initiative website. Please visit it and tell all your friends and classmates to visit it as well. Now, when I do my analyses, I use a multidimensional One Health matrix, or a cube, if you will. I'm illustrating it with a Rubik's Cube. So you can have in these One Health factors, humans and animals. So here's one little cube, plants, environments, and ecosystems. For the complexity factors, microbial, individual, population. And you can look at political, social, and economic factors, which are extremely important. And you can divide that up by political borders, either local, regional, national, or international, global. So this is the framework in 2 dimensions, and you can see the intersecting boxes. So in this presentation, I'm going to look at some of these boxes in examining these issues. Other definitions, environments are the abiotic aspects of geographic areas, the soil, the water, the air. And ecosystems are the biotic interactions, the interactions between the microbes, flora, and fauna within defined geographic areas. So looking at this then, the One Health analysis, one cube is going to look at humans and domesticated livestock, terrestrial livestock, looking at fecal microbes, microbial populations. We're going to look at plants, cereal crops, environments and ecosystems, the water, soil, air, and the global resistome, which I'll explain later. And then at the very end, we're going to look at the political, social, economic factors, the international global food security demand for meat. So in other words, I'm going to give you a One Health satellite perspective of these issues that are confronting us. So let's look at the first One Health analysis, humans and their domesticated livestock at the global level. So there's, as of 2021, there's almost 8 billion humans. And we have, according to the FAO, around 30 billion terrestrial food animals. The FAO is actually a treasure trove of data waiting to be analyzed, if you're so inclined in data analysis. But humans and their domesticated livestock constitute around 96 to 98% of the global terrestrial mammalian biomass. There's just not that much wildlife left. This was back in 2000, humans and their livestock. In terms of diversity, livestock are not diverse at all. It's still the biodiversity rests in the wildlife. So there are more broiler chickens. The combined mass of all broiler chickens exceeds that of all other birds on Earth, with a standing population of almost 23 billion, with growing meat demand. And as the famous children's author Taro Gomi writes, all animals eat, so everyone poops. And we produce around 4 trillion kilograms of poop each year, combined human and animal fecal mass. And that doesn't include companion animals, that's just the livestock. 4 trillion kilograms each year. So this, just to kind of put that into perspective, the total fecal matter then produced by humans and their livestock would fill over 1.6 million Olympic-sized swimming pools, or if we want to put it another way, would bury the entire surface area of Los Angeles and New York in 6 feet of poop, and we are producing increasing amounts each year. So there's challenges, of course, with fecal matter. If we look just at human fecal matter, over 670 million people still defecate outdoors. It's called open defecation. And a lot of people don't have access to basic sanitation, and these are the parts of the world where they lack basic sanitation. With animal fecal matter or manure, it's much harder to figure out what exactly is going on with it because we don't really have good data. This was one global assessment of manure management that I found online done in 2014. They did a survey of 30 out of 34 countries, or their survey of 34 countries found that 30 of them do have national policies related to manure management. And of those that responded, they found that generally enforcement is regarded as weak, and there's a lack of coordination between the ministries, and it's really unclear what their policies and procedures are. And of course, it's important to note that sanitation systems are designed to handle human fecal matter, not animal fecal matter. Now, in the United States, we have what are called concentrated animal feeding operations, or called CAFOs, and you can see that they're packed with animals, and they produce a tremendous amount of manure. This report from the U.S. Government Accountability Office back in September 2008 found that no federal agency collects consistent, reliable data on CAFOs, and that some large operations can produce more than 1.6 million tons of manure a year, some that can generate more raw waste than the populations of some U.S. cities produce annually. So we're dealing with a great unknown with a tremendous amount of waste. And there are pathogens or microbes that cause disease in fecal matter. 1 gram of feces can contain 10 million viruses, 1 million bacteria, 1,000 cysts and eggs, and a whole slew of bacteria that can cause serious disease and even death. There's also pathogens in animal fecal matter, and there's a whole list here. But there are compared to human fecal matter, there's actually very few studies examining the pathogens in animal fecal matter. And for some inexplicable reason, animal fecal matter is generally ignored by the global health community, which is a serious problem since they produce 80% of the 4 trillion kilograms that are produced each year. Now, in 2015, the World Health Organization released a report estimating the global burden of foodborne illnesses, and these are the different parts of the globe that are most afflicted, particularly the African regions. And they estimate that about 1 in 10 individuals are sickened by food each year. And of the 600 million people who get sick, around 420,000 die, and children under the age of 5 make up 40% of the cases. And the agents that cause the most hazards are the diarrheal disease agents, or the bacteria that are present in human and animal fecal waste. They cause around 550 million illnesses and 230,000 deaths. So we're talking about serious problems for human and animal health, or for human health specifically. Animals might also get sick from exposure to these microbes as well. So let's now move to the second analysis involving plants, microbial populations at the global level. So, the world has over 50,000 edible plants, but just 3 of them, rice, maize or corn, also known as corn, and wheat, provide 60% of the world's food energy intake. Plants require light, carbon dioxide, water, and healthy soil, but most importantly, they require these macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that you normally get in fertilizer or manure. Now, some of you may have heard of the Green Revolution. This is Dr. Norman Borlaug, who was a plant pathologist, and he was working for the Rockefeller's Foundation and was assigned to work in a program in Mexico to try to improve wheat harvests. And he developed a genetically modified wheat that was resistant to disease and adapted to different growing conditions with high yields. And these wheat varieties spread from Mexico to Asia and South America, and it became known as the Green Revolution. He averted famine for millions of people and was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. And you can see the success of his efforts because beginning in 1961, cereal production and cereal yield just took off and met the needs for the growing population. And most impressive, it was accomplished through relatively unchanged land use. So they didn't have to convert forests or other land over to fields. They were able to do it on the land that was already being used, which was incredibly impressive. And here you can see cereal yields in 2018. A number of countries, particularly the US and China, are big major producers of these cereals. But unfortunately, with the benefits come the costs with the Green Revolution and with the intensive farming practices, because in order to grow so much food on the same amount of land, you need intensive water, intensive fertilizers, and they also use pesticides. And they use genetically modified crops, which led to political opposition. Now, back in 1961, most of the nutrients provided to plants, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the potassium, was provided by manure. And the use of manure remained relatively flat from 1961 to 2019. In 1961, 1.5 times more manure was used than fertilizer. But if you look at the use of fertilizer, the use just really skyrocketed. And by 2019 now, 4 times more fertilizer is used than manure, which is one of the problems with the Green Revolution. Because fertilizer has a lot of problems, which I'll briefly discuss in the environment. It causes eutrophication of lakes, killing marine life, causes more runoff, and it contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. Manure also has problems, but it does provide the soil organic matter. It's a more stable, slow releasing form of nitrogen, we have a lot of it because it's produced naturally by animals. So there are many beneficial uses of manure, but if it's not being used as fertilizer, then the question is, well, what's being done with it? So that then brings me to the third One Health analysis, looking at the environments and ecosystems at the global level. And to start out, I'm going to talk about the environment, and the most important thing facing us is climate change. And climate change threatens agriculture, and agriculture, unfortunately, worsens climate change. And to really understand climate change, we need to look at a geographic timeline of the temperature of the planet. So this is the Paleozoic era, when you had thriving life in seas, but the land was barren. And yes, the planet was very hot, but there were no humans and there was no agriculture, so it wasn't really an issue. The planet cooled with time, and you start getting into the Ice Age, where much of the planet was covered with thick sheets of ice. But then the planet began to warm, and we start to enter what is called the Holocene era, the era that we are in now. For the past 10,000 years, the temperature of the planet has been on this Holocene baseline that has allowed agriculture and has allowed civilization to exist. The climate has been relatively mild, predictable, and conducive to agriculture. We have now gone up about 1 degree. There was a deviation from this Holocene baseline. It was called the Little Ice Age, and the artists at that time documented for us what the Little Ice Age looked like. But before I move to the next slide, I just want to highlight this book, Timefulness: How Thinking Like a Geologist Can Help Save the World, is a really interesting book that I highly recommend. So the artists from the Little Ice Age documented for us what it looked like. The Thames in Britain froze over. They had frost fairs. You see frozen wastelands, ice skating on the main canal in Rotterdam. But most importantly, the Little Ice Age was noted for crop failures, bread riots, famine, and wars, because agriculture basically collapsed during this period of time. So the World Bank estimated that by 2050, if we continue with our current trajectory, assuming current agricultural practices and crop varieties, most of the world is going to become too hot and too dry to grow the crops that we need for survival, not only for us, but for our food animals, the livestock as well. There will be some arable land up in the north, assuming that the soil is fertile. But even today, we still have a lot of hunger. And you can see that large parts of Africa, which are already starting to experience the droughts, the impact of climate change, as we are witnessing here in the United States. But in many other parts of the world, there's now extreme flooding and other fires and many serious effects. So now manure and synthetic fertilizers emit potent greenhouse gases. They are major sources of methane and nitrous oxide. So here's carbon dioxide. Methane is about 28 times more potent than carbon dioxide at trapping heat, and nitrous oxide is 265 times more potent than carbon dioxide at trapping heat, and that is a serious problem. So here in the United States in 2017, the methane emissions, manure contributed about 9%. Enteric fermentation, which is essentially cow burps, contributes about 27%. But in terms of nitrous oxide, manure contributes 5%. And agricultural soil management, which means the intensive use of fertilizers, these high nitrogen fertilizers, release nitrous oxide into the atmosphere. 74%. So the green revolution, yes, it fed many people, but this reliance on these high nitrogen fertilizers for the increased yield has contributed a lot of nitrous oxide into the environment, and that's a serious, serious problem. So I'm not sure exactly where the Holocene baseline is. This is 1990, but right now we, of course, want to stay as close to the Holocene baseline as possible. Right now, our trajectory is well above the Holocene baseline. We would ideally like to be below 2 degrees. 2 degrees is around here. 1.5 degrees, we want to get our trajectory down here. And we are not on track with that at all. So we have a lot of work to do if we want to maintain agriculture, civilization on a planet that has a climate that's conducive to it. So let me now switch to ecosystems. Antimicrobial resistance, it turns out that the environment and the ecosystems play an enormous role in antimicrobial resistance. Many of the soil microbes make antibiotics, and it turns out that they use these minute amounts of antibiotics to communicate with each other. And so studies done by scientists in the environment using metagenomics found antimicrobial resistance genes everywhere. They're in the Arctic, they're in the Antarctic, they're in caves that have never seen human anthropogenic, human antibiotic exposure. And scientists have called it the global resistome. And by our massive use of antibiotics, indiscriminate antibiotic use in humans and animals, we are changing the global resistome. So we are adversely impacting it with a lot of human and animal waste just going into the environment, particularly if it's untreated. And most animal waste, I would venture to guess, is untreated, leading to land and water contamination. Interestingly, these are two completely separate studies. The one is the estimation of global fecal mass that I introduced to you earlier in the talk. These are the countries that have a lot of world's fecal production, including the US, Brazil, India, and China. But if you look at the ratio of animal to human feces, something interesting comes up. And Australia and New Zealand have a lot more livestock than people, so they have a very high animal to human fecal ratio. Now, in a completely unrelated study looking at global antibiotic consumption, something very strange happened, and it turned out that Australia and New Zealand have some of the highest antibiotic use per person in the world. Now, why would Australia and New Zealand have such high antibiotic use? Well, if you look at the map, maybe this is purely coincidental, I don't know, but maybe there's something about all the fecal matter in the environment causing illness, making people sick, and contributing to their use of antibiotics. So is there a relationship? I don't know. I think that's an important question that should be investigated. And this study, done in veterinary sciences, found that manure serves as a potential hotspot for antibiotic resistance gene sharing. So again, lots of animal manure in the environment not only contaminates the environment, but it alters the microbial ecosystems as well. So finally, the fourth One Health analysis, looking at humans and focusing on the political, social, and economic factors. Food security, again, is the foundation of civilization. It means no hungry people. And it's built on 3 pillars: availability, access, and use. It's so important that the United Nations listed it as its second Sustainable Development Goal, zero hunger. And it's important to realize that there are political implications when the price of food becomes too high, when there is food insecurity, people start to riot when food becomes unavailable, and civilization starts to break down. These are the countries where meat consumption is the highest, the US, Argentina, certainly Australia, New Zealand, and parts of Europe and Asia, where meat consumption is very high. There are pros and cons to eating meat. Meat provides important micronutrients such as vitamin B12 and iron. And there's evidence that we evolved into modern humans because we hunted, cooked, and ate meat. Eating meat is an integral part of many religions and cultures, but of course there are cons. It's not essential if we supplement our diet with vitamin B12 and other vitamins and minerals. It increases zoonotic spillover risks, and that's another whole talk that I'm sure you've heard much about in terms of zoonotic diseases and One Health. As I'm showing in this talk, raising billions of domesticated animals, or even hunting wild animals, contaminates environments, contaminates ecosystems, and in the case of wildlife, reduces biodiversity. Global meat production has skyrocketed to meet growing demand, and eating meat is the norm almost everywhere. This is the share of respondents who say they eat meat. Interestingly, India has the largest fraction of vegetarians in the world, largely because of Hinduism requires or mandates vegetarianism. But even in India, the demand for meat is increasing. Nevertheless, there are potentials to change national dietary preferences. This was a study done by the Gallup poll. More Americans are cutting back on meat consumption, primarily women. Why are they cutting back? Well, they're concerned about their health. They're concerned about their environment, food safety, animal welfare. Convenience is really an irrelevant reason. But most importantly, cutting back on meat requires cultural and societal change, which is not an easy thing to do. So in summing up, looking at our One Health analysis findings, we have found that human and domesticated animal populations are growing and producing increasing amounts of fecal matter each year. Animals produce about 80% of the global fecal matter, but it's generally ignored. Both human and animal fecal matter contain many dangerous microbes, but sanitation systems are designed to process human waste, not generally animal waste. There's little oversight of manure management in many middle and low income countries, and there's certainly little oversight of the CAFOs in the United States, for example. Plants need nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, which are contained in manure, but synthetic fertilizer use predominates. And as I showed you in a couple slides, that manure management and agricultural soil management emit methane and nitrous oxide, which are potent greenhouse gases that are worsening climate change. In addition, manure is contaminating the global resistome, which worsens antimicrobial resistance. And all of these findings have implications for food safety, for the practice of medicine, for food security, and the continuation of agriculture. So what can be done? Well, in 2016, the UN General Assembly met to discuss the problem of antimicrobial resistance, and the World Health Organization developed a national global action plan to serve as a model for nations to develop their own national action plans, and it had 5 strategic objectives. Objective 3 was to reduce the incidence of infection through effective sanitation, hygiene, and infection prevention measures, but there is no mention anywhere in the plan of manure management and its impact on environments and the microbial ecosystems, which I think is a huge oversight, even though they are saying that a One Health approach is very important. They aren't really doing that. Similarly, the Paris Climate Agreement talks about many things, but there's no mention of curtailing agriculture's important greenhouse gas emissions of methane and nitrous oxide. Again, another huge oversight. There are strategies to reduce methane and nitrous oxide. There's different ways that you can manage manure by changing how it's stored. You can use what are called methane digesters that capture the methane that's being released and use it as a form of renewable energy. And for agricultural soil management, the goal is to not over-fertilize the soils and to use low nitrogen rather than high nitrogen fertilizers that are currently the practice, to use cover crops and no-till farming and other strategies to reduce the release of these gases into the atmosphere. I looked high and low across all nations to see if there were any legislation to address agriculture's contributions to greenhouse gas emissions. And the only one I could find was the state of California passed a short-lived climate pollutant reduction strategies. Mr. Ricardo Lara was the one who spearheaded that, and its goal is to reduce dairy methane emissions by 40%, and that would use these methane reduction projects, including digesters to capture methane as an energy source. But we have a long ways to go if only California is the one who passed legislation. So we must restore our beautiful planet, and One Health recognizes that life is interconnected. And so you might be thinking, well, what can you do? Well, this whole hackathon is incredibly important because it provides you with the opportunity to learn about One Health. And I encourage you to continue your studies, spread the word, get politically engaged, organize and be the change agents that our planet needs, that we need in order to continue on as close to the Holocene baseline as we can to ensure the continuation of agriculture and food security for everyone around the world. My course was briefly mentioned, Bats, Ducks, and Pandemics, an Introduction to One Health Policy. I adapted this course from the course that I teach to Princeton University freshmen. There's now over 5,300 students from around the world. And I do use the lectures on this course to teach my students at Princeton. So it is free, it is online, and I highly encourage you to check it out. It is meant, again, for the general public, including most importantly, college freshmen and high school students would be, you are all just as capable of taking this course as anybody else, I am sure. So I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues in the One Health Initiative. This is our website, please visit it. This is the team. And I would like to thank you all for your time and attention.